co-editors. It's my pleasure to introduce the co-editors of the special issue on global reproductive justice and feminist economics. To start us off, we have Dr. Rishita Nandagiri. She's a lecturer in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London. Her research focuses on gender and reproductive injustices in the Global South. She has worked with several feminist collectives and advocacy groups globally and has consulted with multilateral organizations, including the WHO and UNFPA. Rishita currently serves on the International Union for the Scientific Study of Population Scientific Panel on Abortion Research and is a council member of the British Society for Population Studies. She's also a visiting fellow in the Department of International Development at LSE and a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Welcome so much, Rishita. Next we have, and let me make sure I'm going to try and get this right, is Dr. Leigh Senderowicz. Did I get that hopefully closely? Close, okay, sorry. And she's an assistant professor of gender and health at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Leigh is a public health researcher and feminist social demographer focusing on global sexual and reproductive health and rights, race, gender, and coloniality. She completed her doctorate in global health at Harvard University and earned her MPH from Johns Hopkins prior to that. Her mixed methods research focuses on contraceptive autonomy, exploring the ways that new approaches to measurement and evaluation could promote person-centered care, health equity, and reproductive freedom. Thanks so much for joining us, Leigh. And last but by no means least is Dr. Wendy Sigle. She's a professor in the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics, where they contribute to teaching on courses on social policy, population studies, and feminist economics. An associate editor of population studies and feminist economics, Wendy has worked on a variety of issues related to fertility and family dynamics in a range of historical and contemporary societies. Applying theoretical contributions and insights from gender theory and feminist epistemology, Wendy's research critiques how quantitative methods are applied and how quantitative evidence is used and interpreted in social research. Thank you so much for joining us, Wendy. So my first question for all of the speakers is, your bios all contain some information about your work in the field of reproductive health and rights, and highlights how you all kind of came together across disciplines for this collaboration as co-editors of this special issue. It'd be great to hear more about how you became interested, particularly in the intersections of economic and reproductive justice, as well as the motivation or inspiration behind the special issue. So Rishita, I'm going to start with you.
First, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you to the IAFFE team and Mary and Paulina in particular for getting us here and all of the hard work that they've done to organize the event. Yeah, thanks for that question. I guess first off, I'm not an economist, not even a little bit, but I am deeply interested in questions of reproductive justice, and this, I guess, fundamentally requires us to understand how economics shapes not just reproduction, but our understandings and visions of justice itself, right? What is it that we are hoping to move towards? And so some of my work around abortion has really been shaped by colleagues like Ernestine Coast, Sam Latoff, and one of the co-authors in one of the papers in the SI, Professor Jana van der Meulen-Rogers, who did some incredible work on the microeconomics and the macroeconomics of abortion. And this has really shaped, it's a really nascent space in abortion, but really, really important, because we know how important it is for us to be paying attention to how, whether you can afford abortion care, if you have to think about things like indirect costs, as well as how, how is abortion budgeted for. So that's like one plank of interest. There's also, I think, for me personally, with some of the work that I do with some of my colleagues, like Dr. Lucia Berra-Pizzarosa, around how we think of reproductive labor, obviously really important when we think about feminist economics. And so some of this work around how we think of what do feminist activists do when they're providing abortion care when the state has abdicated its responsibility also raises a new set of questions on what does it mean to do this care work? What kinds of monetary implications does it has? Has the state in essence effectively handed over this debt in essence, to feminist actors. And lastly, thinking at this big macro scale, we're functioning in a space of neoliberal logics. Here in the UK with a two-child policy, for example, or we're thinking about these increased welfare cuts. How does disability align with increased pressures? And what does that mean for what kinds of reproductive decisions you can possibly make? And so it's in this space that we're thinking about what is reproduction. Our meanings, our understandings of what then justice looks like have fundamentally shifted. And so when Wendy reached out, it was a really exciting moment to think about, okay, what does that mean? How can we bring together feminist economics, something I don't know that much about, alongside some of these questions? What else can it allow us to imagine? And for me, and selfishly in some ways, it was a way for me to learn to read things and to engage with some of these important intersections that I was hoping, and I think some of our authors in the special issue ended up doing. But yeah, that's sort of was what was behind wanting to be part of this project for me.
Thank you so much. Leigh, over to you.
Before I start, I'd just like to echo Rashita's thanks to the organizers of this fireside chat. I'm just like so happy to be here with you all today. And also, like Rishita, I'm not an economist. I have no formal economic training, but I do spend a lot of my time in economic adjacent parts of demography and reproductive health. And there are a lot of concepts that are borrowed from econ into this field that I think tend to treat gender relations and family formation as just another set of inputs and outputs. So we can think about something like applying the quality quantity trade-off to family size, which leads people to talk about things like low quality children as just like one example of the ways that I think econ has engaged with reproductive health and rights in maybe not such a great way. And so it seemed like a really great moment to join up with other feminist scholars to talk about the power and possibilities of the RJ framework to push back against some of that orthodox economic thinking, as well as to engage specifically with feminist economists to see where the RJ framework could help even heterodox economists expand their toolkits, expand their ways of thinking around gender, race, and coloniality, and how those things intersect with reproduction. So like Rishita, this was, I think, an exciting way for me to bring sort of my expertise to a new field and get to learn a lot about a new field. And actually, I'll say that I've been so inspired by what I've learned about feminist econ as a subset of the discipline that I'm now trying to sort of rally demographers to build up some of the infrastructure in demography that feminist economists have built up in their own discipline.
Thank you so much for that. Wendy, over to you.
It was worth saying twice. It's worth saying a third time. Thank you so much to both Mary and Paulina for everything you did to make this event happen. I'm enormously grateful, and I know it was not the easiest thing to get scheduled and going, so I really appreciate it. Rishita and Leigh both sort of covered some of my motivations. I mean, it's part of the reason why I wanted to ask them to be guest editors. I went to the IAFFE meeting shortly after the Supreme Court decision came out that overturned Roe v. Wade. And everybody was rightly fixated on the Dobbs decision. And when I went to the AGM for IAFFE, we spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of response would be appropriate. And one of the most important interventions, I think, came from people who said, what happened in the US is super important, but it has to have a global focus. And I had a lot of sympathy with that. I think the US is important because it is high visibility, and because, as we're seeing at the moment, it's a really important donor, at least up until now. So what happens in the US is important, but it sometimes overshadows what happens elsewhere. From a policy perspective, I think economics has been extraordinarily influential in demographic issues and reproductive issues more generally. And my main concern as an economist, thinking about my own journey towards feminist economics, is how you become a feminist economist if your training was very much in the classical neoliberal tradition, because a lot of the thinking within that tradition is pretty incompatible with feminist epistemologies. So how do we adapt the epistemology in a way that accommodates feminism better? And I think the distinction between reproductive rights and reproductive justice is a really beautiful illustration of the kind of challenges that emerge when we try and make feminist economics more feminist, as opposed to what some people call gender economics, which is where we just kind of incorporate gender into the standard economic methods and approaches and conceptual frameworks. So I was really keen to inspire people to think a little bit about how to get out of the neoclassical box, how to become a bit more heterodox. And instead of thinking about what economics can offer to other disciplines, which was kind of what I learned in my economics training, we could take economics to anthropology and explain institutions. We can take economics to sociology. And, people talk about economists as being colonizers of other disciplines. I wanted to see what economists could learn from other disciplines and how they could accommodate the challenges when they're pushed back. And I could think of no better people to push back than Rishita and Leigh.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you all for your responses. There's so much, so many threads from the that you brought up that tie to the introduction you all wrote, and I think Pauline is going to drop a link to that in the chat as well. One piece I really wanted to pick up on is that, and Wendy, you already started discussing this, is you highlight the importance really of the reproductive justice framework in particular, and contrast this with more narrow conceptions of reproductive rights, and particularly as is often conceived, right, in the US, I think, versus globally as well. I'd love to hear from all of you why you felt like this framework was so important and what it really brought to this special issue. So this time I'll kick it off with Leigh. Over to you.
Thank you. There is just so much value in this framework. The RJ framework is deceptively simple. It really seems straightforward at first. I was just teaching it to my undergrads yesterday, and they were sort of like, "What's the big deal here?" Seems pretty clear. Maybe even obvious at first. Just these sort of three simple tenets. But the longer you study the RJ framework, the more intensively you engage with it, the more you realize how complex it is, how demanding the framework is, how rigorous the framework is, and how powerful it is. So for a really long time, the reproductive rights agenda, both I think in the US and globally, was framed as either pro-contraception and abortion or anti-contraception and abortion. And you're either with us or you're against us. And lumped together in that pro-contraception and abortion group were feminists, but also eugenicists and population controllers and all other types of people who are coming with their own motivations for supporting reproductive rights in that way, all lumped together. And Rishita and I actually have a new paper out in population studies that we draw from here, and I'm happy to drop a link to that in the chat if folks are interested. But one of the many things that RJ allows us to do is to articulate a really important distinction between those who want to use contraception and abortion to control their own bodies or to enable others to control their own bodies versus those who want to use contraception and abortion to control the bodies of others. And that distinction allows for a more expansive conversation about all of the reasons that one group of people might want to control the reproduction of another group of people, which in turn makes space for much broader conversations about gender, coloniality, racialization, and all of these interlocking axes of oppression that render different people in different social positions susceptible to really, really different forms of reproductive oppression. And RJ does that in a way that the reproductive rights framework just doesn't. So if you read our introduction to this special issue, you'll see that we start out by focusing on a story out of Maharashtra in India, We look at women who work on the sugarcane plantations there, who are so deeply trapped in a usurious wage debt that they're getting hysterectomies at really high rates. And the reason for that is that if they get hysterectomies, then their menstrual cycles, and everything that goes along with menstruation won't interfere with their farm labor. From everything we've understood, these women are consenting to the hysterectomies insofar as they can. And a reproductive rights framework or even mainstream economic theory, I think, might have us understand that these women are making a choice within a certain choice set to increase their productivity and to control their bodies in a way that they choose. But the RJ framework really helps us expand the question and ask, what does it mean to even make a choice within such crushing constraints? As well as to ask why this group of people's bodies and why their reproductive capacities would be so systematically devalued that this would even seem like a rational choice to make. And so it's just that expansiveness of the RJ framework that goes so far beyond just the choice to use contraception or abortion that I think makes the framework so valuable.
Incredibly interesting and helpful. And I think you did a wonderful job summarizing some of the really interesting examples from the introduction. But Rishita, let me turn it to you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I agree with Leigh completely. I think, I think for me, what RJ is really, really important, in addition to what Leigh said, is that it is a political, it's rooted in a political consciousness. And I think that feminist political consciousness is deeply, deeply important, right? Like it has a certain set of histories that it developed from. And I think RJ allows us then, when we're talking about this interlocking matrix of oppressions, it requires that political lens to see this not as siloed issues, right? Not additive, but as something that is co-constituted, co-constructive, which is what allows us then to see in this particular political moment that we are in globally, how your reproductive rights here in that sense are equally tied to our efforts for racial justice, to our efforts for gender equality, to trans rights, and that you can't separate them out. And I think this is deeply important, not just for how we think about allyship and how we think about solidarity building or responses, but also for what our analyses actually are. How is it that we can begin to understand these co-constitutive relationships? And the second thing for me that's really important with this is how RJ allows, can function in different contexts, right? So obviously, once again, it's coming from very particular histories of Black feminist thought in the United States, but this is something that has seen iterations quite simultaneously in global South feminisms, where this same political lens of how do we understand, what kinds of questions are we able to ask, have come about, and that we can use this framework to not just analyze a problematic or a set of problematics in a specific context, but also speak and see how these function transnationally, how these same anti-rights movements or these same shifts connect us rather than separate us. And this resonance, I think, is deeply, deeply important. And once again, in this political moment, I think RJ, the gift that it gives us is a vocabulary. It allows us to understand and analyze how these rollbacks that we are seeing, these attacks, are not singular. And again, what that co-constitutive relationship is. And so for me, that's what is so valuable about sitting with this framework epistemologically, conceptually, methodologically. Thanks.
Thank you. And as you said, very timely indeed to think about all those intersections. And Wendy, over to you.
I think Leigh and Rishita covered a lot of the big main points, and I think we have kind of a shared understanding and appreciation of the framework. But coming at it from the perspective of an economist, I think there's a big difference between, as an economist, working with reproductive rights and working with reproductive justice. And when you understand the distinction between reproductive rights and the RJ framework, which I saw Maria Matthew asked, it is the Ross and Solinger framework. that we're talking about here. When you move from reproductive rights to reproductive justice, you want to look at the right to have children and to raise them in a healthy environment alongside the right not to have children. And that's enormously important because it pushes us away from individualistic analyses, which economists are very prone to. We like to hold all else equal. And we like to do constrained optimization. So rather than look at the costs and benefits of not having a child, of getting an abortion, or choosing to contracept, we have to embed that decision within a framework where having children should or not is part of the choice set. And that means we have to look at people's initial endowments and not have Pareto optimality guiding our thinking, because the initial endowments that people have might be unjust. They might actually make it impossible to have children so that abortion is the only option. And then that's not a right, that's a coercion. And I think when we take that thinking to sort of quasi-experimental econometric methods, we start to see how economic epistemology does some of that controlling work that Leigh mentioned. When we estimate microeconometric models of the determinants of contracepting or not, usually from economists who are interested in getting women to start using contraception, we're actually thinking about how we can help policymakers nudge people in the direction they want them to go, rather than thinking about actually fulfilling a set of rights. And if we think of feminist economics as an ethical project, we've got to sit with those ethical issues that are related to standard economics toolbox methods, as much as we're thinking about the conceptual frameworks. And anybody who's ever taken a course with me, and I see a couple of people in the participant list who have, will know that I'm a big proponent of thinking about the alignment between conceptual framework and methods. And many of the standard methods in economics are not aligned with the RJ framework or with that kind of multi-level framework, which takes structure and politics seriously. So from my perspective, part of the Feminist Economics project is coming up with methods which are better aligned with more feminist conceptual frameworks. And as I said in my opening comments, I think the RJ framework provides a really beautiful and timely and enormously important illustration of that.
In complete agreement, and I know we're going to get back to a bit of the kind of mainstream economics versus feminist economics here in a bit. But before that, I want to turn to Rishita, and I know, as you pointed out, Rishita, that some of this has been answered already, but in the introduction, you all also really interrogate the application of intersectionality in this context, arguing for the importance of structural and political intersectionality. So I was hoping you could tell us more about these distinctions and why the structural and political components are so important, particularly for feminist economic work on reproductive justice.
Yeah, and I think Wendy had been touching on some of this already, and Leigh as well, in some of our previous responses. But yeah, I think, so if we understand that what reproductive justice allows us to do is pay attention to these intersections, right? These intersections of race, of gender, of class, and how these link together to form this matrix of domination. And this is functioning both at the social level as well as at the structural level, shaping this idea that we have choice, that there are reproductive choices. And that this matrix of domination, what that ends up doing is that it stratifies these choices. And if we don't account within these choice frameworks, we're not fully accounting for these structural conditions. Once again, if your welfare caps or the two-child benefit cap here in the UK, for example, or the removal of social protections and how this affects people differently. It's not a uniform thing. It's tied to your social location. Then this decision not to have a child is not really a free choice, because the conditions, these structural conditions, are creating this this space where it becomes irresponsible, quote unquote, irresponsible for you to have a child under these conditions. So the only viable option here then is for you not to have a child, right? So if you cannot have a full set of viable options, then it's no longer, your choices are no longer a reflection of your rights or your rights claiming, but becomes an obligation. And the way that these structural constraints function, and we see this not just in the introduction. Some of our authors, like Martina Yopo-Diaz, has really looked at how structural infertilities function in Chile. In the dialogue pieces, we have Kalpana Wilson and Deborah Nunez, all show that if we only focus on the right not to have a child, it's overlooking how policies or these structural conditions can actually directly or indirectly constrict the right to have children and to raise or parent them. So Kalpana Wilson, for example, also talks about how in the current situation with Palestine and thinking about, or Sudan and Congo, like how these conditions of war, of starvation, of famine can restrict your right to raise and parent these children too. So how we can't disconnect ourselves from engaging with these broader sets of conditions of violence, of inequity, of neoliberal policies, all of which are shaping the conditions under which people reproduce or choose not to reproduce, or the conditions in which you're raising your families. And as I said earlier on in one of my first responses, is if we pay attention to these structural conditions, that also requires us to pay then attention to the political conditions, how you cannot separate out gender from race or other intersections. When RJ came really as a response to movements where say where white liberal feminism, for example, had really focused on gender, while a lot of anti-racist political movements had really prioritized the concerns of Black men. And where reproductive justice and intersectionality really pull together this idea of political intersectionality, requiring us to then, alongside structural intersectionality, to interrupt some of these ideas of representing or speaking only for the interests of a single social category. And that if we didn't pay attention to this, if we didn't pay attention to structural and political conditions, it functions in a very limited and a limiting manner. So when we are able to pay attention to this, it allows us a more comprehensive and a more complex set of interrogations to emerge, and a more complex set of analyses to understand what exactly are these intersecting and interlocking matrices of oppression that create forms of injustice. And of course, alongside that, then how is it that we can begin to tackle them? Once again, I think in this moment, if we look to Argentina, for example, where this commitment to structural and political intersectionality saw a really socially just abortion law come into place that did account for these different intersections, different modalities of how it is, for example, someone might need or want to seek an abortion. That was one way that could be operationalized. And even now with under Milieu's government, this is the same political intersectionality is allowing that feminist pushback to some of the rollback of the rights that we are seeing. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I thought that was a very compelling part of the introduction. I think how you all tied it together was again really powerful. My next question is for Wendy. And Wendy, as I said, I know you've already touched on this quite a bit, but another thing that I thought would be of interest to participants today was, how you discussed the incompatibility of reproductive justice with mainstream economic approaches, particularly neoclassical economics and rational choice frameworks. So I don't know if you had anything else to add there, but I wanted to give you the chance to see if you wanted to bring anything else up.
Yes, thank you. And sorry for preempting that a bit in my earlier answers, but it's always kind of central in my mind. I first wanted to say there is a paper in the special issue by Hazal Attai and Hélène Perivier from Choice to Capabilities, Abortion and Reproductive Justice, which I think addresses some of these issues really well. And I would commend that paper to anybody who wants to sort of read a critique of how people tried to work within neoclassical frameworks and study abortion in particular. I see a comment in the chat. We can address that later. I also wanted to say, building on what Rishita said, I think part of the incompatibility between neoclassical economics and rational choice frameworks and RJ is also reflected in a very narrow understanding and operationalization of intersectionality in a lot of work by economists. Because in order to work within the neoclassical framework, you're often describing complex interactions, but thinking of intersectionality as sort of just different social locations, rather than problematizing the locations themselves. And what neoclassical methods encourage people to do is document difference, whereas RJ encourages you to really delve into, explain, and it challenges you to transform those differences because they're an issue of fundamental rights. And again, that shifts the focus of methods, it shifts the focus of research, and it reorients the kind of questions that we're asking. And I think that's enormously important. The standard kind of neoclassical approach that I learned, and I teach this in a lecture of feminist economics that I give here at the LSE, is, if you think of your standard constrained optimization problem, we really take people's initial endowments as given. And we say people can make choices given the resources that they have. Feminist economics, and you see this sort of bridged with the use of the capabilities approach in the paper I just mentioned, says, no, the choice sets are actually something we fundamentally need to consider. But when we moved to sort of start thinking about the capabilities approach, we had a methodological problem because we didn't really have the methods that allow us to operationalize capabilities particularly well. And the links and similarities and resonances between the capabilities framework and the RJ framework, which are explored in this paper in particular, I think illustrate and bring those tensions to light in a really compelling way.
Thank you so much, Wendy. And to kind of keep us on time so that we make sure we have time for Q&A, I'm going to combine some of my next questions. And so I'm going to ask each of you to comment for us on maybe the most interesting discovery you made while co-editing this special issue, some key findings you want to highlight that perhaps have not come up thus far, or any other pieces that you want to bring up in terms of how this can inform a new agenda for feminist economics. So I'll ask that you all try and keep your responses to a tight 2 to 3 minutes, just so we can, again, have time for Q&A. Leigh, let me start with you.
Thank you. I think the most surprising thing for me was how nascent this work was. I mean, I'm coming from a reproductive health space where RJ has been sort of the predominant research framework, or at least we pay lip service to it for at least the past decade. And so it was really interesting to come to a new field and see that RJ hasn't quite made its mark here yet. And we're happy to sort of be, making an attempt to change that now. In terms of key findings, I think we have such a diversity of findings and of perspectives and theoretical contributions that it's hard to boil it down into just a few takeaways. And I just really encourage everyone on the webinar today to take a look at the articles, because they're just really wonderful. But I came away from this experience believing even more in the transformative power of reproductive justice to change how we think and talk about reproduction across disciplines. And I think that some of the particular challenges that we faced, that I think maybe I'll just build on what Wendy has been saying, is that it's what the challenge that remains ahead of us, and that we certainly don't fully resolve in in this issue is how to incorporate the RJ framework not only into our motivations and our rationale for doing the work that we do, but into the quantitative analyses themselves. And as Wendy's been saying, RJ by definition is an expansive and intersectional framework, and Rishita's been saying that as well, that its contribution is that it resists the type of discrete categorization and the partitioning of the variance on which something like a regression analysis depends. And so there's just sort of this fundamental tension between what RJ is asking us to do and what our methods are asking us to do. And so I really appreciate the contribution that Laura Sosha and Jenny Chanfro made in one of the dialogue pieces, suggesting ways that random effects models might be a way to allow for more of that sort of contextual messiness to remain in the models, whereas fixed effects try to control them away. But I think that those authors would be among the first to say that that doesn't resolve this tension at all. It's making a sort of a small contribution, but there's just a lot of great discussion in this issue as well as a lot of unanswered questions about how to align our methodological approach with this theoretical commitment to RJ. So I have lots more. I could keep going all day, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Rishita.
Yeah, once again, just echoing everything that Leigh and Wendy have said so far. I guess I'll focus on what surprised me and then some of the takeaways. I think for me, what surprised me was, just how nascent we were with some of this thinking. I thought we would be inundated with articles, but as Leigh actually alluded to, and Wendy as well, we saw quite distinct things that were very economicsy, but not quite RJ, or we saw things that were very RJ, but not very much engaging with feminist economics. And so for me, I think this commitment to interdisciplinarity requires just such a committed space. And I think the journal and IAFFE were instrumental in getting us to at least this point. And I think that is also where I think we need to focus, is really building these spaces to communicate, because one of the other things I realized is, Wendy's enormous patience in explaining why something I had taken completely for granted as a not economist wouldn't quite translate. So Wendy, and even now I think, has been doing such an incredible committed, and I take so much work, it is labor, to translate across disciplines and these spaces, whether it's around how we use certain terms or what those words mean, and what kinds of bodies of knowledge we're drawing on. I think really building on that is something that needs to happen. And I think for me, one of the key things that we contribute, of course, there's so much more to do and so much more to say and engage with critically. But I think the dialogue pieces, once again, Wendy quite instrumental here in bringing a lot of these incredible authors and thinkers together, really sets up some of those ways that we might begin to engage with key areas to take some of these very important interlocking, intersecting spaces forward. Stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Wendy, over to you.
I'm trying to think what I have to add over and above what Leigh and Rishita have already covered so beautifully. So I'm going to focus on process a little bit. I think I learned a lot about interdisciplinarity in the review process, and how the review process is not very well set up for interdisciplinary work because of the way papers have to get submitted, reviewed, and rejected. And I would say for pretty much every paper in the special issue, we engaged directly with the authors, sometimes with Zoom calls, sometimes with multiple Zoom calls, often going back and forth with the drafts with our own comments in it. It highlighted to me how useful it is, and I would recommend to anybody, I've said this before in other forums, if you're ever doing a special issue, workshop the papers, because we ended up having to sort of back engineer a workshop with ourselves and the authors in a lot of cases. It was super rewarding, but it also meant that our time scale got continuously stretched as we went back and forth with the authors multiple times. I guess the one thing that struck me, and well, two things struck me. First of all, the generation of feminist economists that are coming up are absolutely brilliant, and we just really need to make space and let them get on with things. And I wanted to sort of say it's wonderful IAFFE has this mentoring program to mentor young people, but also so that they can teach us older people where they're really seeing where the discipline needs to go, because it was really clear to me that some of the best thinkers are some of the early career people, and they're really driving an important agenda. And finally, I guess I should have known this, but I think I am in very weird ways in very specific locations of my life overly optimistic. I was actually struck by how many people outside of economics don't feel able to engage with economists. So this is kind of related to what Rishita said. I was expecting a load of people who would be able to sort of grasp neoliberal terminology and economic concepts, which really are underpinning a lot of policy language, and be able to engage with economists at least on that level. But the resistance or lack of confidence, perhaps, because that goes back to the difficulties of interdisciplinary work, which characterized interactions with people who were not economists and trying to nudge them to talk more with economists, was really revealing. And I think we have a lot of bridge building work to do to learn from other disciplines as well as from early career scholars.
Really great points from all of you. I could say a lot, but I know I've already talked a lot and got a chance to ask a lot of questions already. So let me open up the floor for questions from you all now. Please feel free to use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. Or if you want, you can drop a question in the chat and it can call on you as well. But we've had a lot of great content thus far, but I know we have a lot of really amazing people on this call today. So we'd love to hear either your questions or comments. I am not seeing anyone yet. Maria, Matthew, I saw that you've dropped some things in the chat just in terms of some additional resources. I don't know if you wanted to come in on any of that or ask any questions to our speakers.
No, I just wanted to add that book in. It's a book by Katha Pollitt. She has been saying some of the same things, but also kind of she doesn't use the framework of reproductive justice, but tries to look at abortion and kind of makes this point that we need to go beyond the binary of pro-life and pro-choice. So I thought for those who are working on abortion, that might be a good book. I think it came out in 2023. Now that I'm thinking, actually feel like sharing something and asking this to the authors. I work with UNFPA, and the ICPD is seen as like a path-breaking kind of agreement, intergovernmental agreement. But do you see that translating to real work on the ground in terms of the guarantees it made regarding reproductive rights? So that's what I want to know. Yeah, over.
Great, and I saw one other question coming in the chat, so I want to pose that as well, so you all can have a chance to respond to both. And that's from Susan Lyons. Unless, Susan, did you want to ask the question yourself? And go ahead and speak.
Sure, I'll ask it.
Okay,
yeah.
great.
I'm sorry to use the term, but I was curious if there were specific examples of academic places that are focused on this work, but what they're seeing in terms of threats or cuts coming from the Department of Education.
I'll turn it over to you all. Maybe I'll start this time with Wendy. And I just also want to say you're getting a lot of love in the chat for your efforts on this special issue. So Wendy, perhaps let's start with you in terms of responses, and then I'll go
Well,
to Leigh.
could I make a suggestion?
Sure.
Given the last question, and that Leigh is the only one of us actually dealing with what's happening in the US, maybe Leigh's better place to sort of start.
Sure, absolutely.
Is that okay?
Yeah, Leigh, over to you.
Boy, I mean, everything's being doged, right? There's nothing that's not, there's no part of higher education in the United States that's not being affected by executive action right now. I could go into a lot of detail about sort of how it's affecting me personally, and it hasn't been great. I think the main thing is that there's a tremendous loss of data. So for those of us who rely on the demographic and health surveys that were funded by USAID, those are canceled. I had a project that was relying on PRAMS data, which is a survey of postpartum mothers conducted by the CDC, and that they say it's going to come back, but that's gone away. So I haven't seen any areas where like reproductive justice has been targeted, or that feminist econ has been targeted in ways that are distinct from the broader project of demography or of science and measurement in the US. But it's been a very difficult time to be a researcher in the US, which I think probably lots of people on this call can identify with. As to the first question about the ICPD, I'll just touch on this very briefly. I'd really encourage folks to check out the paper that I dropped a link to in the chat. I think we've maybe overestimated what ICPD has been able to do for us. You know, we often talk about it as a sort of a feminist high water mark for reproductive rights. And I don't mean to diminish all that we've been able to accomplish as a result of ICPD, but I'm wary of giving ICPD too much power as like this miraculous document that ended population control once and for all and ushered in this sort of idyllic era of reproductive rights, and certainly not reproductive justice. I think Rishita and I in our paper talk about some very important compromises that went into the crafting of the ICPD consensus and sort of the implications of some of those compromises that have continued to reverberate over the last 30 years.
Rishita, Wendy, either one of you want to jump in?
I can just really quickly, I think just, obviously I'm not based in the US at all, but I guess when I'm thinking about the efficiencies, I think the impact I think that we're seeing quite clearly internationally is around how USAID has been affected. And though particularly with HIV, even though there's been some exemptions that you can apply for, there was a paper, I'll try and find it, that came out yesterday where they'd analysed, well, the vast majority of nonprofits or groups globally don't know how to apply for those exemptions. Those exemptions are taking too long, and we're seeing the material consequences of this quite immediately. Apart from the lack of access to medicines, you know, very clearly that means breastfeeding or chest feeding seropositive people are no longer going to be able to access medication. And often when you don't have access to other forms of food to feed those children, that is going to result in higher, a higher rate of infections. So I think we are, if we don't then pay attention to how something like HIV is not just about the medications, it is also about this question of how is it that we raise and parent the children that we have. If you can't access food and your food source and your medication source are all linked together, then this is going to have these catastrophic impacts. So that was something I thought that came up for me. On the ICPD, I think there has been an effort recently to talk about the ICPD and connect it to reproductive justice. And I think in that paper that Leigh talks about, that has Leigh's put in chat, I think if we go back and we look at some of what a lot of global South feminists, what feminists from Latin America, from South Asia, like Dawn, from the women's health networks, had all tried to do in 1994 was advocate for and push for what we would now call reproductive justice. But that was not politically expedient. Right? That wasn't how we could get a win. So I think this is why currently now the ICPD is something we're terrified to open up because of the backsliding. We're constantly told you can't open it up because we're afraid we'll lose what little we have. And part of that is because it rests on such shaky grounds. So I think rather than try and hold on to the little that we have, I think reproductive justice calls for us to demand more, to imagine better, to imagine otherwise. And so for me, the ICPD it's not so much as a backstop, which is what we treat it like. I think it's the bare minimum that we've asked for and that we've been told you need to protect that at all costs. So I think we should see this as a moment, as an impetus to demand more and demand better.
I'll just add a couple of things. I think reproductive justice has not been hit head on in the same way other things have been hit on, as from my outside perspective, because it's not so obvious a target like critical race theory. Very few people are going to go, oh, I'm against reproductive justice. And I think the approach by the US government is much more Orwellian, and it's targeting words. So the attack on reproductive justice scholarship is going to be through the vocabulary rather than at the framework itself, because let's be honest, as the discussions of critical race theory show, the people who are embarking on the attacks have no idea what they're attacking. They just have an idea of anger, and they want to direct that anger in a particular direction. So I think it would be sort of an indirect process where research was attacked for using words like racism, inequality, stratification, all the words that have been identified as worrying to the government and ones that we shouldn't be using in government documents and research. In terms of Cairo, I'm probably even a little bit more critical of it than Rishita and Leigh, because I think that the victory came because feminists were able to make the compromise that said we implicitly agreed that poorer women wanted to have fewer children and were being stopped from controlling their fertility. So what feminists said was government shouldn't control fertility. They should put the power to control fertility in the hands of women, which is fine, but they sort of conceded ground by making it appear that that was the only legitimate reproductive issue. And that means that it ended up becoming an issue that was primarily of concern to well-resourced people who could afford to have children and raise them in a healthy environment, and empowering them to make the decision to have the number of children when they wanted, and to achieve an outcome where poor women would reduce the population in ways that would be a win-win synergy. And whenever there's a win-win synergy being put forward, I get really worried about what's being left out.
Thank you all for those responses. We might have time for one more question or comment if anyone does want to raise a hand. Otherwise, I'll probably turn it over to some reflections.
Maybe if I
Yeah,
could just
please.
add, I'm sorry, I'll just add very briefly one quick thing to what Rishita and Wendy said in terms of what's sort of happening in the US right now. One is that it bears mentioning that when I said reproductive justice hasn't been singled out, I do want to say that research on trans and queer populations has absolutely been singled out. And that's a really important part of reproductive justice. And so I wanted to sort of correct what I said previously about that. And then the other thing I want to flag is that I think part of the Doge ethos, and certainly the person who's leading Doge has a very strong pronatalist ethic and the threats of that coming through more and more in executive policy, I think will pose a tremendous threat to reproductive justice moving forward.
Very important points indeed. Valerie, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I am a Zambian. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Zambia. And I have a question. I missed something on the methodological framework. I heard something about the capability framework. So I'd just like the authors to just speak a little bit on the methodological approach that they use and the adaptations that they made, if any, to the capability framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. If maybe one of you particularly wants to take that question, or a couple of you want to speak to it briefly.
I can just jump in. We aren't the authors of that paper. We're the editors of the special issue. So the paper was written by Hazal, who's actually here, and maybe could speak to you directly about what they did. But what they were talking about was the capability framework as a framework to adopt as a way of maybe identifying resonances with the RJ framework and guiding thinking. My position is, and other people might disagree with me, that we don't have the methods yet because we're so wedded to the traditional economics toolbox. We often have methodological misalignment between the way we think about the world as a multi-level, complex social structure and very individualistic, all else equal methods, which approach experiments as closely as possible. So I think the post-positivist critique has a lot to offer feminist economics and would raise a lot of challenges, which would open up space for new methods. But I'm not sure we have identified exactly what those methods are. And much of the work is fairly nascent. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, because I've been struggling. I'm trying to find the methodology for my research, and I've just been in the space. Yeah, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Nice to meet you.
Wonderful. Well, thanks everyone for your questions. And again, editors, you're getting a lot of love in the chat for what an important contribution this special issue is. As we wrap up, I just want to give you a chance to share any final reflections with participants today. I think you covered a ton of ground, from kind of the theoretical framework to methodology to political implications to consequences for kind of thought and academia and freedom of thought. I do think one thing that you've highlighted is really the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration going forward, and also some of the challenges. So to the extent that you want to talk about that in your reflection, I think that would be interesting, but I'll leave it up to you. And perhaps whoever wants to jump in first, I'll just open the floor.
I'll go. I don't want to take up too much time. I just want to say to wrap up, what an incredible learning experience this was for me. I learned so much, both from the authors that we worked with, as well as from my brilliant co-editors. I came away from this experience more certain than ever that RJ can help us think through what our values are, and how the struggle for reproductive freedom is intertwined and inseparable from other freedom struggles. And as sort of each day brings news that we could have never really fathomed before, I've been holding tight to that, to like really holding to RJ as sort of a life raft that helps me stay true to my values and stay true to, as Rishita mentioned, sort of this possibility of building a better world, not just sort of going back to what we had, but building a better world moving forward. And I just really want to, again, thank Rishita and Wendy, who have two of the most brilliant minds that I've ever encountered. It was intimidating at times working with them, but I'm really, really grateful for this learning experience. So thanks to both of you, and thank you especially to Wendy for really steering this ship.
I'll just go really quickly, and I'll again echo everything that Leigh said. Yeah, for me, I think I have learned so much. And I think partly like my ability, my vocabulary to try and speak across boundaries and try and bring some of these disciplinary spaces a little closer to figure out where it is that we might connect, where it is that we can, like, what are the problematics here. And I've learned so much genuinely from Leigh and Wendy on how to do that with grace, quite honestly. Not the most patient person, but I've definitely learned from Wendy and Leigh how to navigate that, and how and definitely from our authors. I think like really it has been difficult because it's hard work to speak across multiple disciplines, multiple backgrounds, not just within our team but also with the authors, and to try and bring something coherent together in a special issue. And so that has also been incredibly rewarding. I think the amount of interest that we've seen, and I again hope that this first effort is really just the first. This isn't where we stop. This isn't the ICPD. We don't stop here. This is the beginning. We build. We try and think about what else can we say. And like, for example, even now, thinking about things like Doge, like that is, I think, a really important space of intervention to think about what does a reproductive justice lens allow us to understand? How is it that we can respond to this and subsequent events? So I think for me, it's hope that I think I go away with, and that's what I hope everyone else will pick up from this as well. Thanks.
Just to add, I feel like we haven't done enough to plug the particular papers. I pointed out one, but I would really love to see a feminist economics of structural infertilities. What an amazing area of research for feminists to go into. I would love to see more work thinking about developing quantitative methods that can capture complex inequalities and interpret them through a structural and political lens rather than a descriptive lens, or one which is very much influenced by the social location of the researcher. And I was thinking when Leigh was talking, you know, there's a conference going on in Florida over the weekend. I think it was Florida, that was a pronatalist conference.
Texas. It was in Texas.
Texas. And, you know, one of the people writing there has written a blog about how access to women sexually needs to be considered a source of inequality, and talking about how men are going to become violent if they don't have sufficient access to women. The RJ framework needs to incorporate bodily integrity as a central component. And it is interesting, I think too much of a focus on the right not to have children was a mistake in the past. And we now risk an emphasis on the right to have children in pronatalist discourses that discount women's bodily integrity in different ways. So not looking at the framework as a whole and not looking at all three things together is what we really need to think about incorporating in the Feminist Economics project, because excluding one of the tenets ends up with lopsided policy and unintended consequences. And my understanding of feminist methodology is that it's transformative and we want to make the world a more socially just place. So that means actually thinking very critically about our methods and thinking about how we challenge dominant discourses which are harmful and oppressive, rather than show complicity with them, because that's how economists have always done things. Can I just say, I'm not saying this will definitely happen because we haven't got it pinned down yet, but I am feeling like we've talked a lot about the editing project of this special issue. I'm really hoping we can find a way to have a second event where you get to talk more directly to the authors. We haven't asked them yet, we haven't pinned anything down yet, but that is my aspiration, because I'd really, really like to create a platform for them to tell you about their work and how their ideas developed. Like I said, structural infertilities in Chile is an amazing way to rethink how we understand reproductive decision-making and to incorporate social structures. Kalpana Wilson's contribution to the dialogue really talks about how expansive the RJ framework is and gives a lot more examples than we were able to. Deb Nunes talks about important epistemological issues in terms of the priorities we set in economics. Siri Su talks about the data that we use and the measures that we use. Jenny and Laura talk about the econometric methods and how fixed effects actually don't capture all that we want to capture. I talked about Hazal. And if you are looking for just a straightforward, excellent empirical paper, Liana's paper, Liana Waski's paper on tubectomies in India and how you can operationalize constraint. What's the word?
Coercion was
That's the word I wanted. Thank you. I'm getting old and I forget words. The way you can operationalize coercion and examine whether people who were getting tubectomies were coerced or not, using data which we're increasingly not having access to, is just a brilliant example of ways that we can change our endeavors just slightly and learn so much more and identify so many more issues that need to be addressed. And I've talked too long. Sorry, Mary.
You have not. And yes, it is definitely our intention to have another event featuring the authors. So please look forward to that in the future. But I want to thank you for those closing reflections, Leigh. In particular, I found myself getting a little misty-eyed. I mean, we live in such an intense moment of, you know, devastating consequences and so much feeling like our hard-fought gains are being rolled back, but it's an important time of reflection for us on this feminist economics project, as you said, Wendy. And I think, you know, finding the points of solidarity and thinking about how important it is to, you know, look across different disciplines, but also different movements and so many different aspects of not just the vocabulary, but the methodology and the theory and the politics. And you all have covered an incredible amount of grounds today in bringing that up. Yes, Wendy.
And I just realized I forgot to mention one of the papers, and I really shouldn't. If you are really into political economy, Annie McGrew and Yana Rogers' paper is a brilliant way of actually looking at reproductive justice from the meso level by looking at the firm level. And I'm really sorry I didn't mention that. I was just trying to think of all the papers off the top of my head. But we've got that kind of political economy perspective covered as well. We have perspectives from economics and from outside economics, and try and encourage you to kind of put the pieces together and see what they mean for your own research.
Great call to action, I think, going forward on the research piece. So yes, I will close by saying, please read the special issue if you haven't already. I think you've gotten a great introduction and hopefully a lot of compelling reasons to dive into this and things to take forward in your own research, in your own advocacy, in your own activism. And just as you, again, try and find places of hope and solidarity going forward. I want to give a huge thank you to Rishita, to Leigh, to Wendy for participating today. I want to thank Paulina and Wendy, our IAFFE staff, for all they've done to support this event. I also want to say again, please look forward to forthcoming events in our online event series. The next event will be launching our Barriers to Feminist Economics series. It's going to be entitled, What Do We Mean by Barriers to Feminist Economics Ideas and Feminist Economists? And it's going to feature IAFFE President-elect Sakiko Fukuda-Par, Diane Elson, and Lisa Prugel. It's going to be on April 24th from 10 to 11:15 Eastern. And we just dropped a link to register in the chat, as well as the paper that the framework that Sakiko will be discussing. So we ended amazingly right on time. So thank you so much to everyone. I really got a lot out of today's discussion, and I hope that you did too. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.